You have heard the warnings about sudden money before. The stories about inheritance checks disappearing in a few years. About people who came into fortunes and ended up with nothing but a list of names who stopped calling once the money did. You heard those stories and assumed they were about someone else. Someone careless. Someone who never had your discipline. Tonight you are not thinking about any of that. You are thinking about rent due in 4 days and a scratch ticket you bought on a whim at a pharmacy counter because the line was long and the impulse was short. 2 days later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, your phone buzzes with a notification from the state lottery app, and for a moment you think it is a mistake. It is not a mistake. $382 million sits behind a number you almost did not check. The regional claims office in Tempe, Arizona looks nothing like the moment deserves. Fluorescent lighting, a stack of folding chairs, and a claims administrator named Renata Alvarez, who has clearly walked dozens of people through this exact conversation and long ago stopped being moved by it. She asks you a single question before anything else. Lump, sum, or annuity payments? You already researched the answer 3 nights ago at 2 a.m. with your phone lighting up the ceiling above your bed. The annuity spreads the full amount across 30 payments over 29 years, each one slightly larger than the last. The lump sum is the amount actually sitting in the lottery fund today, discounted for time. You choose the lump sum before she finishes asking. The number that lands is $191 million. Nearly half of the advertised prize disappears the moment you choose speed over patience. Renata slides the next form across the counter without missing a beat. Federal withholding takes 24% immediately, another $46 million gone before you leave the building. What remains is $145 million. Renata mentions almost as an afterthought that this withholding is only a partial payment. Because a prize this size pushes you into the highest federal bracket, another payment comes due the following spring, close to 13% more that nobody collects today because nobody needs to. By the time you file your taxes, the number that is actually yours settles around $119 million. Then she tells you the one piece of good news in the entire room. Arizona does not add a state tax on top of the federal bill for lottery winnings above a certain claim structure that your attorney will explain later. And for a moment, the number stops shrinking. A consultant named Marcus Whitlow, recommended by the lottery office before you even reach your car, hands you a business card and uses the word trust the way a lifeguard uses the word current. He explains a private trust can hold the prize instead of your own name, keeping you off any public winners list and keeping your address out of databases that strangers know how to search. It sounds like routine advice to him. To you, it is the first sentence of an entirely new language you did not know you would need by morning. You sit in your car in the parking lot holding a folder with your name on paperwork worth more than your entire extended family has earned across 3 generations combined. Your phone buzzes. Your older sister has called 6 times since yesterday, and you have not answered once. You finally call her back with the engine running and the air conditioning fighting the desert heat. She picks up before the first ring finishes. You do not lead with the number. You ask about the mortgage instead, the one she has complained about for years. $41,000 remaining feels like something real in a way that $119 million does not yet. 4 days later, you are standing inside a regional bank branch outside Phoenix, and the loan officer keeps glancing at you like she is trying to place your face from somewhere. The payoff clears in under 15 minutes. Your sister does not say thank you. She just stands in the lobby crying quietly, and you realize this is the first time in years you have watched her stop calculating in her head. For about a month, everything you touch feels like it works. You clear $11,000 in overdue bills for your childhood friend Priya Nandakumar, who has worked the same shift at a regional shipping hub for 5 years and never once asked you for a dime. You do it without warning her. She finds out when the collection calls simply stop. That is the version of generosity that comes naturally to you. What comes less naturally is everything after it. Your inbox fills with messages from classmates you have not spoken to in a decade, from strangers, from a fundraising link forwarded through group chats you did not know you were still part of. You try responding to everyone for a week. You cannot keep up, and the exhaustion of trying starts to feel worse than any single no ever did. Then your cousin Dominic Farrow calls 3 weeks after the news somehow spreads through the family the way it always does. He wants $75,000 to launch a food truck business. You wire it that same evening. No paperwork, no repayment schedule, because asking your own blood for terms feels like an insult you refuse to deliver. What nobody explains to you in that moment is that money handed over this way has no legal route back to you. It is not a loan. It is a gift. And gifts vanish quietly into a down payment on a truck that never gets built and a weekend in Las Vegas with people you have never met. 5 months later, Dominic calls again, not to explain, but to ask for $180,000 more, saying it like the money is simply owed to him. For the first time since the bank lobby, you say no. He tells the rest of the family you have changed, that success made you cold. You did not turn your back on anyone. You just found the edge of what you are willing to give without ever being asked how you are doing in return. That night, in a rented condo that suddenly feels too quiet, you understand something you could not have known sitting in that pharmacy parking lot. The people who loved you before do not want a person anymore. They want a machine that dispenses money on command. And the moment the machine says no, it stops being family and starts being the villain of the story. You begin browsing real estate listings that same week, searching for somewhere with a gate and distance built into the floor plan. The closing takes place in a law office in Naples, Florida, not inside the property itself, because homes at this price rarely close any other way. A title officer named Selena Whitcomb slides 14 pages toward you, and you sign for a $19 million estate on a private canal without ever walking through the front door. 12,000 square feet, 8 bedrooms, a boat dock built for a yacht you do not yet own. You wire the funds the same way you wired money to Dominic, quickly and without hesitation, except this time nobody on the other end is going to call you a sellout for it. You fly down 2 weeks later to see it in person, and it is every bit as striking as the photos promised. It is also, on the first night sleeping there alone, the quietest place you have ever existed inside. Your footsteps echo across floors worth more per square foot than the house you grew up in. A home theater sits with no one in the seats. A pool glows turquoise for no one watching it. You hire a full staff to keep the property running. A housekeeper, a groundskeeper, rotating security, and within 2 weeks you realize they have become nearly the only people you speak to on an average day. The bills arrive, the way bills always do, just with more zeros attached. Property taxes, hurricane insurance, round-the-clock security, a private chef 3 days a week. It adds up to roughly $240,000 a month just to keep the gate locked and the lights on before you have purchased a single thing for yourself. Against $119 million on paper, that number should feel small. It does not, because your mind has stopped being able to hold numbers that large in any meaningful way. $240,000 against 9 figures simply reads as background noise. That confusion is how you end up in a boutique watch dealer's office off 5th Avenue South, purchasing a rare chronograph for $42,000 on the resale market, not because you truly want it, but because for 5 minutes you want proof that money still does something to you. It works, briefly. You meet a woman named Colette Marchetti at a small diner near the coast, the kind of place with sticky menus and coffee that never runs out. For nearly a month, it feels ordinary in the best possible way. You in a worn hoodie, driving a borrowed sedan, nobody performing for anybody else. Then one evening over dessert, she mentions, almost too casually, a specific catamaran she would love to sail sometime, describing it in exact detail. It is the same boat sitting under your name through a holding company nobody outside your attorney is supposed to know about. She had it searched before your second date. You learn later that this is not unusual at your level of visibility, that people run background checks the way others read reviews before ordering dinner. You stop dating after that, not from heartbreak, but from sheer exhaustion. The isolation you built to escape one kind of pressure has quietly become a different kind of cage, and you are beginning to understand that a fortress keeps things out in both directions at once. Nothing gets in, but nothing gets out either. You start looking at your accounts differently after that, less interested in the total and more interested in what is actually reachable. 6 years into this new life, you sit across from your wealth advisor, a calm and precise man named Julian Okafor, in an office overlooking a bay you technically own a view of but rarely see anymore, since you sold most of the original furniture and half the art collection the previous spring and never replaced either. He turns his laptop toward you instead of simply stating the number, as if he wants you to read it yourself. $34 million remains. That is the figure you have carried quietly in your head for months, the one that still sounds like safety. What he shows you is that $34 million is not sitting anywhere close to liquid. Most of it is the estate, worth something on a spreadsheet, worth nothing until a buyer actually appears. A portion is a fractional share in a private aircraft program you joined 2 years earlier, an asset that costs money, whether you fly it or not. The rest sits inside a private investment fund a previous advisor placed you into, money that returns only when the fund itself decides, sometimes 7 to 10 years down the line. A slice more than you want to admit has already gone to legal fees, because apparently being worth 9 figures means occasionally being sued by people you have never met. You ask Julian the only question that actually matters. How much of this can you spend this month? The figure he gives you is smaller than your monthly burn rate, and that sentence follows you the entire drive home. So you agree to a plan that sounds sensible in the moment and reckless only in hindsight. You take out a margin loan of $11 million against your remaining stock portfolio. The shares stay exactly where they are, still yours, still technically growing, while the borrowed cash covers your burn rate for another year or two. You are not selling anything, and that is precisely what makes it feel safe. You still own every share. You have simply borrowed against what they are worth today. What nobody explains clearly enough, not Julian, not the paperwork, not the pleasant voice at the private banking desk, is what happens if what they are worth today stops being what they are worth tomorrow. The loan has no opinion about your long-term plans. It only tracks collateral value, checked automatically every single day by a system that has never heard your name. You sign in early spring, and for a while it performs exactly as promised. The 11 million lands, the monthly pressure disappears, and for the first time in years, you believe you finally understand how wealthy people use debt instead of losing to it. You do not think about the loan again for 8 months. There is no reason to. The markets have been calm, and Julian has not called. Then on a Wednesday morning in late autumn, he does. He calls at 5:52 in the morning, and you know before answering that nobody calls that early with good news. A sharp market downturn has wiped nearly 23% off major indexes in a single week, faster than any model at his firm anticipated. The shares backing your loan are no longer worth what they were in spring. The bank does not ask what happened. It does not care what happened. It needs $6 million in cash within 48 hours, or it liquidates whatever it must to make itself whole. You sit on the edge of your bed, doing the math, the way you have done math since that pharmacy parking lot, quickly and hopefully wrong. You are not wrong. You have a $19 million estate that takes months to sell, even in a strong market, a fractional jet share nobody wants on 2 days' notice, and a portfolio that is the only real thing standing between you and the number the bank just gave you. There is no version of the next 2 days that produces $6 million any other way. So the bank does exactly what the paperwork always allowed it to do. At the bottom of the worst week the market has seen in years, it sells your shares for you, not at a time you would choose and not at a price you would ever accept, simply the fastest execution available. By Friday afternoon, the portfolio that anchored everything else is gone, not reduced, gone completely. Standing in the kitchen, holding a phone that has stopped ringing, you assume this is the bottom. It is not. 5 weeks later, a new accountant named Priscilla N. Kemalu, the third one you have hired since your original advisor retired, calls about a filing discrepancy buried inside a property transfer structured 2 years earlier, back when you still had people around you who were supposed to be checking exactly this kind of thing and were not. It is a miscalculation that sat quietly until someone finally opened the right file. The tax authority wants $1.9 million, original amount plus penalties plus interest that has been compounding the entire time unnoticed. There is no negotiating a figure like that. It is not dramatic. It arrives as paperwork on an ordinary Tuesday like everything else in this story has, and it finishes what the margin call started. The foreclosure notice reaches the Canal House 5 weeks after that, delivered by a process server who is quiet and almost apologetic about it, as if he already knows exactly what is inside the envelope and wishes someone else were handing it over. You stand in the doorway of a house you closed on inside a law office without ever seeing it first, and you sign for the notice the same way you signed for the house, quickly, finally, and completely alone. You spend your last night there walking through rooms that already feel like they belong to someone else. The pool still glows turquoise through the window. Nobody has ever really been in it. By morning, you are packing what fits into 2 duffel bags. The studio apartment you move into back in Phoenix is smaller than the one you had before any of this started, and the irony is not lost on you, that you have somehow ended up with less space than the version of yourself who bought a scratch ticket out of boredom. The rental application asks for your credit score. 498. You watch the leasing agent quietly recalculate whether to even consider you, and for a second you are back in that pharmacy parking lot, except this time nobody is holding a winning ticket. Within a month, you are back on a warehouse floor on the edge of the city, sorting freight for a company that is not the one you worked for before, but might as well be. $17 and change an hour. Your body remembers the motion before your mind catches up. The twist, the lift, the ache settling into your shoulders by the fourth hour. The tax authority is still owed $290,000 from what was never recovered before your accounts ran dry, and the law allows a portion of every paycheck to be garnished until it is paid down. What actually lands in your account each week is smaller than the number on the stub, and you do that math every payday now, something you never used to think about at all. Here is the part almost nobody warns you about. The first time you were broke, you did not know any different. It was simply your life. This time, you know exactly what silence in a 12,000 square foot house sounds like, exactly what a rare watch feels like on your wrist, exactly what it is like to say yes to anything without checking a balance first. That memory does not fade. It simply sits there beside the $17 an hour, refusing to be useful. You visit Priya one Sunday, the friend whose bills you quietly paid off years earlier, the one who never once asked you for anything after that. She is still at the same shipping hub, still driving the same car, but she owns a modest place now, has chipped away at her mortgage, and puts something small into her retirement account every single month without ever making it a headline. You sit on her porch with a drink that costs less than the tip you used to leave without thinking, and you realize she is not just fine. She is free in a way you have not been since the day Renata Alvarez slid that first form across the counter in Tempe. You think about everyone who wrote to you, everyone who called you cold when the answer was simply no. And you finally understand something you could not have understood standing in that claims office holding $119 million with no idea yet what it would cost you. The money never actually changed the people around you. It just widened the distance between you and everyone you had ever loved, one transfer at a time. That night, waiting at a bus stop in the rain because your car is in the shop again, you watch someone about your age scratching a ticket under the flickering light of the shelter, grinning like they already know something good is coming. He looks up, catches you watching, and asks if you can imagine what happens if he wins. You know exactly what happens. You just do not know how to say it in a way he would believe. The ticket was never the thing that broke anyone. The bus doors close, and you do not answer him. You simply watch the window fog up between you and the version of yourself he still is. You understand the ache of a warehouse floor at midnight better than most people ever will. And you know, now that money never touched that ache at all. It only gave it somewhere bigger to echo. Tomorrow, you will clock in again before sunrise, and the garnishment will still take its share, and the porch at Priya's house will still be more comfortable than anything you ever paid millions for. What stays with you on the ride home in the rain is a single question you cannot quite put down. Whether the empty rooms broke you first, or whether you walked in already broken and the house simply gave it somewhere bigger to live.